Degree murder. Matthew Rosengart is a former federal prosecutor. He's been monitoring the case probably as closely as we have, and we appreciate that because I got a ton of questions. Greg and I were on live yesterday during some of the most riveting testimony. A lot of inconsistencies in this case, first of all, and I got to start with the medical examiner who didn't know if he was there, if he did this, what the protocol was. Forensics can be very important in the case. Did it sound like it was botched to you, and who would do what with that?
I think botched may be a little bit too strong of a term, but I think it's highly problematic for the prosecution, as have many witnesses in this case been. If I were to sum up this case in 2 words, they would be reasonable doubt. Even the casual viewer of Law and Order knows that in order to convict someone criminally, it's a very high burden of proof, reasonable doubt. I think the forensic issue is particularly important in this case because of what I call the CSI factor. Jurors think that there will typically be forensic evidence that will be convincing beyond a reasonable doubt, and I think that's lacking here.
They want that aha moment. What about the fact that George Zimmerman first says that he is aware of the stand your ground law in one instance, and then he says he never heard of it or knew about it beforehand?
I think that's an inconsistency as well. I think to the extent that the government is trying to argue that that's sufficient circumstantial evidence to meet their burden of proof, it fails there as well.
What about the fact that the defense is arguing self-defense in this case? They haven't gone with stand your ground, at least at this point. But in Florida, it's peculiar, and I practice there. I just want to raise this with you, that then the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it isn't self-defense. You see anything in their case that would prove that beyond a reasonable doubt?
It's a very interesting and important question. Before this trial began, as you know, we heard so much about the stand your ground law or stand your ground defense. We haven't heard a lot about that or anything about that yet from the defense team. And I think the reason for that, strange as this may sound, is it's arguably irrelevant. One thing we know, although none of us were here, is Zimmerman was on the ground. I think this becomes a standard classic self-defense situation. The question is, did George Zimmerman believe in his mind subjectively that he was in danger of imminent death or grievous bodily harm? There was a fight there, and again, I think there's sufficient evidence for the defense to argue that there is that standard that's been met.
What about, as well, the moms? Both of them get on the stand and predictably say, that's my boy screaming. Last night, I had an opportunity on the Fox Report to talk to Judge Alex, who we know is a death penalty qualified Florida judge, and I asked him about whether the moms cancel each other out. And he raised a good point, and I want to ask you what you think about this as a former federal prosecutor. You probably never heard your kids scream at that, as he said, decibel level, screaming for their life. Is their testimony reliable, relevant, or do they cancel each other out?
I think they do cancel each other out. I think it's relevant. I think it's compelling. I think this is a good example where the jury can say, you know what, I believe both of them. Any mother is going to want to believe that it was her son crying out. I think they cancel each other out. I don't think the jury needs to think that either mother was lying in that particular circumstance.
As difficult as it must be for them to listen to that. The other question that I really have is, the jurors have this long holiday weekend. They're sequestered. They can't really talk about it. They can't watch any of the reporting or the media. But they did see George Zimmerman yesterday for the first time get emotional. This is the video that we just showed. Did that make him more relatable, more real? How do jurors respond to that?
I think it makes him both more relatable and more real. For the government to prove its case, they have to prove that he acted with malice, with some sort of evil intent or depraved heart. And the jurors will be asking themselves, based on the videos they've seen of him and his demeanor in court, whether that's the type of person who had that malicious intent or depraved heart. I think he does come across as somewhat relatable. And even if he doesn't, again, I keep coming back to reasonable doubt, that very high standard, and whether or not the government's met it here.
The other issue is this video, or lack thereof. One of the Sanford police officers, Serino, gets up there and says, when we were questioning George Zimmerman, we told him that it was likely caught on video, and he reacted, oh good, I was hoping that someone would see what happened. And Serino says on the stand, To me, that meant that he had nothing to hide and that he wasn't guilty. The judge disallowed that. You've seen Judge Deborah Nelson, tight court, but the jury heard it anyway. They can't consider it under jury instructions, will they?
2 points about that. First, I don't know about you, but I have never seen a detective actually vouch for the credibility of a defense witness. That said, you're right, the judge did tell the jury to disregard it. You can't unring that bell. The jury heard it. The jury heard a detective vouch for the credibility of a defendant. That's very powerful. Secondly, I think George Zimmerman's reaction to that trick, and it was perfectly appropriate, police are allowed to engage in that sort of trickery, is again very, very compelling. Why? Because it goes to his state of mind. This isn't a whodunit. We know that George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin. The issue is, what was his state of mind?
At that time.
At that time.
Yeah,
And if he reacted and thought that there was a video, to me that shows that he had an arguably innocent state of mind.
All right, well, the jury's not hearing you and that opinion either, and they're not supposed to consider Serino. These are points that we haven't really had a chance to talk about yet, so thank you so much, Matthew. It's great to meet you. Matthew Rosengart.
My pleasure.
Good to have you here. Greg?
Well, the feds